September 12, 1946. Dover, England. The ferry from Calais cut through the grey waters of the English Channel, carrying 43 German women who had no idea what awaited them on the other side. They stood on deck in silence, clutching their small suitcases, watching the white cliffs of Dover emerge from the morning mist like the walls of a fortress they were being sent to invade. Among them was a woman named Greta Hoffmann, 26 years old, a trained nurse from Hamburg, thin from years of wartime rations, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, her hands scarred from long hours of work in understaffed field hospitals where supplies ran out and patients died because there was simply nothing left to give them. Greta had volunteered for this program, the British Medical Relief Initiative, not because she wanted to go to England, but because she had no other choice. Hamburg was rubble. Her apartment had been destroyed in the firebombing. Her hospital had been bombed twice. There were no jobs, no food, no future. Just the slow, grinding reality of a defeated nation trying to survive. The British government, desperate for medical staff to deal with their own post-war crisis, had created a program: bring German nurses to England, give them work permits, house them, feed them, and in return they would work in British hospitals, caring for British patients, many of whom had lost sons, brothers, husbands to the war Germany had started. Greta expected hostility. She expected hatred. She expected to be treated the way German hospitals had treated foreign workers during the war, as tools, not humans, necessary evils to be used and discarded. But when the ferry docked, when Greta and the other nurses stepped onto British soil for the first time, something happened that none of them expected. A woman was waiting at the dock, middle-aged, wearing a nurse's uniform with a Red Cross armband. She smiled, actually smiled, and said in careful German, "Welcome. We're glad you're here." Greta stared at her, certain she had misheard, because enemies don't welcome each other. Victors don't smile at the defeated, and the British, who had every reason to hate Germans, shouldn't be glad that German nurses had arrived. But the woman's smile didn't waver, and as Greta walked past her onto the dock, into enemy territory, she heard the woman say it again. Welcome. If stories like this matter to you, listen closely. Because this is not a story about forgiveness. It's not about forgetting the war. It's about the moment when a nation that had been bombed, invaded, terrorized for 6 years made a choice to treat their former enemies with dignity, not because those enemies deserved it, but because treating people with dignity, even when they don't deserve it, is what separates civilization from barbarism. This is the story of German nurses who came to England expecting punishment and found something they hadn't experienced in years: humanity, and how that humanity broke them in ways the war never could. Because it's easy to hate your enemy when they confirm your worst expectations. But it's impossible to hate someone who treats you with kindness when you don't deserve it. History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of German women crying in British hospitals, not from cruelty, but from compassion, from the shocking, devastating realization that the enemy they had been taught to fear was capable of grace. The bus ride from Dover to London took 3 hours. Greta sat by the window, watching the English countryside roll past. Fields, villages, churches. Everything looked so intact, so untouched, so different from Germany, where every city was a graveyard of broken buildings and shattered lives. The other nurses sat in silence, their faces reflecting the same confusion, the same disbelief. They had expected ruins. They had expected a country as destroyed as Germany. But England, while scarred, was standing, functioning, alive in a way that Germany no longer was. They arrived at a facility on the outskirts of London, a former military barracks that had been converted into temporary housing. The building was clean, sparse, but there were beds with real mattresses, blankets, a dining hall with tables and chairs, a bathroom with running hot water. Greta touched the faucet in the bathroom and watched hot water pour out. Real hot water, not the lukewarm trickle she had gotten used to in Hamburg, where the pipes were damaged and fuel was scarce. She put her hand under the stream and felt tears prick her eyes, because it was such a small thing, such a basic thing, and she hadn't experienced it in over a year. That evening they were served dinner, not rations, not watery soup, but actual food: potatoes, vegetables, bread, a small piece of meat. It wasn't lavish, but it was more than Greta had eaten in a single meal since before the war ended. One of the nurses, a young woman named Ilse, barely 21, looked at her plate and whispered in German, "Is this a trick?" "What do you mean?" Greta asked. "Are they trying to make us trust them before they punish us?" Greta didn't answer, because she was thinking the same thing. This couldn't be real. The British couldn't actually be treating them like human beings, not after everything Germany had done, not after the Blitz, the bombings, the U-boats, the occupation of the Channel Islands, not after 6 years of war. But the food was real. The hot water was real. The clean beds were real. And when a British administrator came to address them that evening, she didn't speak with contempt or hostility. She spoke with efficiency and clarity, like someone outlining the terms of a job, not a punishment. "You will be assigned to hospitals throughout England," the administrator said through a translator. "You will work alongside British nurses and doctors. You will be paid a modest wage. You will have 1 day off per week. You will be expected to follow hospital protocols and treat all patients with professionalism and care. If you have any problems, if you face any hostility from patients or staff, you are to report it immediately. We will not tolerate mistreatment of any kind." Greta blinked. Mistreatment? They were worried about Germans being mistreated? The administrator continued, "I know this is difficult for many of you. I know you may feel unwelcome. But understand this: we need you. Our hospitals are overcrowded. Our nurses are exhausted. And you have skills we desperately require. You are not prisoners. You are not servants. You are professionals. And we will treat you as such." The room was silent. Several nurses were crying quietly, because they hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected to be seen as professionals, as humans, as anything other than the enemy. They expected punishment. They expected to be used as cheap labor, exploited, humiliated. They expected British patients to refuse their care, to spit at them, to remind them every day that they were the enemy, the defeated, the ones responsible for 6 years of death and destruction. But what they found was something far more complicated. Greta was assigned to St. Thomas's Hospital in London, a massive facility on the south bank of the Thames, partially damaged by bombing but still functional. She was placed in the surgical ward, working alongside British nurses who had been dealing with wartime casualties for years. On her first day, Greta met her supervisor, Sister Margaret Clark, a stern woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. Sister Clark looked Greta up and down, then said in clipped English, "Can you start an IV?" "Yes," Greta said in careful English. "Can you change dressings?" "Yes." "Can you follow orders without arguing?" "Yes." Sister Clark nodded. "Then we'll get along fine. I don't care where you're from. I care if you can do the work. Can you?" "Yes." "Good, because if I have to train you from scratch, I'll send you back on the next ferry. Are we clear?" "Yes, Sister Clark." "Then get to work." And that was it. No speech about the war, no reminder of Germany's crimes, no hostility, just work. Because Sister Clark didn't have time for politics or grudges. She had a ward full of patients and not enough staff to care for them, and if a German nurse could help, then a German nurse would help. But the patients were different. The patients remembered. Greta's first patient was an elderly man named William Fletcher, 72 years old, recovering from pneumonia. When Greta approached his bed to check his vitals, he looked at her and said, "You're German." "Yes, sir." He stared at her for a long moment. "My son died in France, 1940, killed by Germans." Greta's hands froze on the blood pressure cuff. She didn't know what to say. She wanted to apologize, to explain, to defend herself. But what defense was there? "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely audible. William continued staring at her. Then he said, "Can you do your job?" "Yes, sir." "Then do it. My son's dead. Nothing you say or do will bring him back. But I need my blood pressure checked, and you're the one holding the cuff. So check it." Greta checked his blood pressure. Her hands were shaking. When she was done, William said, "Thank you." It was the last thing Greta expected to hear. Thank you. From a man whose son had been killed by Germans. Thank you. She walked away from his bed and had to lean against a wall to steady herself, because the hatred would have been easier. The contempt would have made sense. But gratitude, civility, recognition of her humanity despite everything, that shattered something inside her. Sister Clark noticed. She pulled Greta aside and said, "That was William Fletcher's test. He tests all the new nurses that way. If you gotten defensive or apologetic or tried to make excuses, he would have refused your care. But you just did your job. That's all he wanted to see." "But his son is dead, and you didn't kill him. You were probably a child when he died. William knows that, but he needed to see if you knew it. If you understood that you're not responsible for the war, just responsible for the work. And you passed." Greta wanted to say that she was responsible, that every German was responsible, that the collective guilt was real and undeniable. But Sister Clark just patted her shoulder and said, "Stop thinking so much. We have work to do." The first month was the hardest. Not because of the work, Greta was used to long hours and difficult cases, but because of the cognitive dissonance, the constant, jarring gap between what she expected and what she experienced. She expected hostility from patients, but most patients were simply grateful for care. They didn't care who provided it as long as it was competent. She expected contempt from British nurses, but most British nurses were too exhausted to care about politics. They were just glad to have help. She expected to be reminded constantly of her status as enemy, as German, as representative of a defeated and disgraced nation. But instead, she was just a nurse, someone doing a job, someone whose nationality mattered less than her ability to start an IV or change a dressing. And that, somehow, was worse than hostility would have been, because hostility would have confirmed what she believed about herself, that she was guilty, complicit, unworthy of kindness. But being treated with basic professional dignity forced her to confront a more complicated truth, that maybe, just maybe, she was more than the worst thing her country had done. One evening, Greta was working a late shift when an emergency case came in. A young woman, early 20s, severe burns from a house fire. The woman was screaming in pain, thrashing, barely conscious. Greta and 2 British nurses worked for hours to stabilize her, cleaning the wounds, administering morphine, fighting to keep her alive. At one point, the woman's mother arrived. She was frantic, demanding to see her daughter, demanding to know if she would survive. Sister Clark tried to calm her, but the mother was hysterical. Then the mother saw Greta, saw her dark hair, her accent when she spoke to the other nurses, and the mother grabbed Sister Clark's arm and said, "I don't want a German touching my daughter. Get her away. Get her out." Sister Clark's face went cold. She looked at the mother and said in a voice like steel, "That German nurse has spent the last 3 hours saving your daughter's life. She has more burns experience than anyone else on this ward. And if you want your daughter to survive the night, you will sit down, be quiet, and let her do her job. Do you understand?" The mother stared at Sister Clark, then at Greta. Then she collapsed into a chair and sobbed. Greta continued working. Her hands didn't shake. Her focus didn't waver. But inside, she felt something crack, because Sister Clark had defended her, had stood up for her, had valued her skill over the mother's hatred. Later that night, when the young woman was stable and sleeping, Sister Clark found Greta in the break room. Greta was sitting alone, her head in her hands. "You did good work tonight," Sister Clark said. Her mother hates me. Her mother is scared. People say stupid things when they're scared. But she's right to hate me. I'm German. My country. Sister Clark cut her off. Your country started a war. You didn't. Your country committed atrocities. You didn't. You were a nurse. You saved lives. And you're still saving lives. That's all that matters to me. But listen to me, Sister Clark said, sitting down across from Greta. I lost my husband in the Blitz, 1941. He was a fireman. Died trying to put out fires after a German bombing raid. So, yes, I have every reason to hate Germans, every reason to refuse to work with you, every reason to treat you with contempt. She paused. But I don't. You know why? Because hatred is exhausting. And I'm tired. I've been tired for 6 years. And I don't have the energy to hate you for something you didn't do. I only have energy to do the work. And you help me do the work. So as far as I'm concerned, you're not German. You're not the enemy. You're just another nurse trying to save lives in a world that's broken. And that's enough. Greta looked at her, tears streaming down her face. I don't deserve your kindness. You don't have to deserve it. That's the point of kindness. If people only received what they deserved, the world would be a much crueler place. The British Medical Relief Initiative brought over 2,000 German nurses to England between 1946 and 1949. The program was controversial from the start. Many British citizens protested. They argued that German nurses should be denied work while British nurses were unemployed. They argued that bringing in the enemy was an insult to those who had died fighting them. But the reality was stark. British hospitals were in crisis. Years of wartime shortages, bombing damage, and staff depletion had left them desperately understaffed. British nurses were exhausted, overworked, and leaving the profession in droves. And Germany, despite its defeat, had a surplus of trained medical personnel. The government made a calculation. Practical need outweighed political optics. And so, the program began. Most German nurses experienced what Greta experienced. Initial suspicion, followed by gradual acceptance. They were not welcomed with open arms, but they were not brutalized either. They were treated with a cold professionalism that slowly warmed into collegial respect as they proved their competence. But there were exceptions, dark exceptions. One nurse, a woman named Anna Kraus, was assigned to a hospital in Liverpool, a city that had been heavily bombed during the war. On her second day, she was attacked by a patient's family member. The man punched her in the face, breaking her nose, screaming that his brother had died at Dunkirk, and he would rather die himself than be treated by a German. The man was arrested. Anna was taken to the emergency room. And when she was released, the hospital administrator personally apologized and offered to transfer her to a different facility. But Anna refused. She said, through her broken nose and swollen face, I understand his anger. I would feel the same if I were him. But I am not leaving. I am a nurse. This is my job. And I will do it. She stayed. And over time, even the staff who had been hostile came to respect her. Because courage, even in the face of hatred, commands respect. By 1948, the perception of German nurses in England had shifted. They were no longer seen as the enemy infiltrating British hospitals. They were seen as colleagues, as professionals, as human beings doing difficult work in difficult circumstances. A British nurse named Dorothy Williams, who worked alongside Greta at St. Thomas, wrote in her diary, I thought I would hate working with Germans. I thought I would see them and think of the bombs, the death, the fear. But when I see Greta, I just see a nurse. Someone who works as hard as I do. Someone who cares about patients as much as I do. Someone who's trying to rebuild her life in a world that doesn't want her. And I find that I don't hate her. I find that I respect her. And that scares me. Because it means the war didn't make the Germans monsters. It just made them enemies. And enemies can become colleagues. And if enemies can become colleagues, then what was the point of all that death? It was a question many people were asking, and the answer was uncomfortable. that maybe the war hadn't been inevitable, that maybe the hatred hadn't been natural, that maybe if people had been willing to see each other as human rather than as categories, the war could have been prevented. They called it the Medical Relief Initiative, but the relief wasn't just for British hospitals. It was for the German nurses, too. Relief from hunger, from homelessness, from the grinding despair of a defeated nation with no future. The irony was profound. Germany had started the war, had bombed London, had killed British civilians, and now British taxpayers were funding the employment of German nurses, feeding them, housing them, giving them opportunities that German hospitals couldn't provide. Greta thought about this often, especially when she received her first paycheck. It wasn't much, but it was more money than she would have earned in a month in Germany, if she could even find work in Germany, which she couldn't. She sent half the money home to her mother, the rest she saved, and she felt guilty about it, because she was benefiting from the war she had lost. She was being cared for by the people her country had tried to destroy. But the British staff didn't seem to see it that way. They saw it as pragmatism, as necessity, as a recognition that nurses were nurses, regardless of nationality, and sick people needed care regardless of politics. One day, Greta overheard two British nurses talking in the break room. One said, "It's strange, isn't it? 5 years ago we were hiding in bomb shelters because of them, and now we're working shifts with them." The other nurse shrugged. "War's over, we won. They lost. Now we all have to live together. Might as well make the best of it." "But doesn't it bother you?" "What?" "That they're here. That we're helping them." The second nurse thought for a moment. "You know what bothers me? The 15 patients on my ward who need round-the-clock care and the fact that I can't be in 15 places at once. Greta helps with that, so no, it doesn't bother me. I'm just glad she's competent." And that, Greta realized, was the essence of it. Competence mattered more than nationality. Usefulness mattered more than history. The work mattered more than the war. It was a brutal lesson in pragmatism, but it was also, in its own way, a form of grace, because it meant that people could be more than their pasts, that they could be judged on what they did now, not on what their country had done before. But not everyone felt that way. In December 1946, 3 months after Greta arrived, a British tabloid published an exposé, "German Nurses Living Better Than British Citizens." The article detailed the housing, food, and wages provided to German nurses and compared them to the rations and shortages British citizens still faced. The backlash was immediate. Protests outside hospitals, letters to Parliament, demands that the program be shut down and the Germans sent home. Greta waited for the announcement, for the termination of the program, for the order to pack up and return to Germany. But it never came. Instead, the government doubled down. A minister made a speech defending the program. Yes, we are housing German nurses. Yes, we are paying them. And yes, some of them may be living better than some British citizens. But let me be clear. We are not doing this out of charity. We are doing this out of necessity. Our hospitals need staff. These nurses are skilled. And if we turn them away because of politics, British patients will suffer. So I ask you, would you rather see your mother, your daughter, your wife receive care from a German nurse? Or would you rather see them receive no care at all because we were too proud to accept help? The protest continued, but the program survived. And Greta, reading about the controversy in the newspaper, felt a strange mixture of shame and gratitude. Shame that her presence was causing conflict. Gratitude that she was being allowed to stay anyway. Greta Hoffmann worked at St. Thomas's Hospital for 3 years. In 1949, when her work permit expired, she was offered a permanent position and a path to British citizenship. She accepted. By 1952, she was no longer a German nurse working in England. She was a British nurse who happened to have been born in Germany. The distinction mattered, because it meant she had been allowed to become something other than her past. She never returned to Hamburg. Her mother passed away in 1950. There was nothing left for her in Germany. Her life was in England now. Her colleagues, her work, her identity. In 1955, Greta married a British doctor named Robert Davies. They had 2 children. She worked at St. Thomas's until she retired in 1981 after 35 years of service. Her colleagues threw her a retirement party. Sister Clark, now in her 80s and long retired herself, attended. At the party, Sister Clark gave a speech. She said, "When Greta first arrived, I didn't want her here. I didn't trust her. I thought she was the enemy. But over the years I learned something. The enemy is just a category we create when we need someone to hate. And when we stop needing to hate, the enemy becomes a colleague, then a friend, then family." She paused, looking at Greta. "Greta has saved more lives than I can count. She has trained dozens of nurses. She has represented the best of what this hospital stands for. And I am proud to have worked alongside her, not despite where she came from, but because of who she became." Greta cried. So did several other people in the room, because Sister Clark's words were true. Greta had become something she never expected: British. Not by erasing her past, but by building a future that wasn't defined by it. When Greta died in 2003 at the age of 83, her obituary in the hospital newsletter described her as a dedicated nurse, a beloved colleague, and a testament to the power of reconciliation. It mentioned, in passing, that she had been born in Germany, but the focus was on her work, her legacy, her impact. One of her former students, a nurse named Emma Richardson, wrote, "Greta taught me that where you start doesn't determine where you end." She came to England as the enemy. She left as a hero. And that transformation didn't happen because she forgot who she was. It happened because we allowed her to become something more. She left Germany as the defeated and died as one of England's own. There is a lesson here. A lesson about the difference between justice and pragmatism, between punishment and progress. In 1946, Britain could have refused to accept German nurses, could have said, "You started the war, you bear the consequences," could have insisted that justice required punishment, not assistance. And many people believed exactly that. But the government made a different choice, a choice based on pragmatism, not justice, a choice that recognized that the war was over and the work of rebuilding had to begin. And rebuilding required nurses. And if those nurses happened to be German, then so be it. It wasn't a moral choice. It wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about necessity. But necessity, in this case, created the conditions for something deeper, for relationships, for understanding, for the gradual erosion of the categories, enemy, German, other, that war had created. Greta didn't come to England seeking redemption. She came seeking work, and the British didn't offer her employment out of kindness. They offered it out of need, but over time, that transactional relationship transformed into something more human. And that transformation was possible because both sides were willing to see past the categories. History doesn't repeat itself. It waits for those who forget to listen. And right now, in a world where we are constantly told that enemies must be punished, that justice requires retribution, that forgiveness is weakness, the story of German nurses in British hospitals matters more than ever. Because it reminds us that pragmatism can be more powerful than ideology, that treating former enemies with dignity, even when they don't deserve it, creates the conditions for peace, that people are capable of change when given the opportunity. Greta Hoffmann was part of a system that committed atrocities. She wore the uniform of a nation that started a genocidal war. She is not blameless. None of the German nurses were, but she was also a nurse. Someone who saved lives, someone who worked alongside former enemies and proved that collaboration was possible, someone who built a new life in the country her nation had tried to destroy. And that duality, that ability to hold both truths at once, is what makes this story important. The guard never sleeps, because the moment we decide that former enemies must be punished forever, that people cannot change, that nationality defines character, we make peace impossible. We trap people in their pasts. We create cycles of vengeance that last generations. But when we make space for transformation, when we judge people on what they do rather than where they're from, we create the possibility for something better. Not perfect, not healed, but better. Greta Hoffman became British, but she never stopped being German. She was both. And that contradiction, that ability to be more than one thing, is what rebuilding requires. The war ended in 1945, but the real work, the work of turning enemies into colleagues, hate into cooperation, war into peace, that work took decades. And it only succeeded because people like Sister Clark chose pragmatism over vengeance. Because people like Greta chose to prove themselves through work rather than words. That's the legacy of the German nurses in British hospitals. Not that they were forgiven, but that they were allowed to rebuild. And in rebuilding, they helped rebuild the nations they had helped destroy. There are more stories like this one. Stories of former enemies working together, not because they forgave each other, but because necessity forced them to see each other as human. If this matters to you, if you believe that peace requires more than treaties, that it requires the hard work of turning enemies into colleagues, subscribe to Warden of War. The archive opens every week, and every story is a reminder that reconciliation isn't about forgetting. It's about building something new from the ruins of something destroyed. Which story should we open next? Tell us in the comments, and let us know. Have you ever worked alongside someone you were supposed to hate? Someone from a different country, a different background, a different side of a conflict? How did it change you? Share your story. Share this with someone who works in healthcare, with nurses, doctors, caregivers who understand that the work transcends politics. Because Greta's story is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful form of reconciliation isn't forgiveness. It's just showing up, doing the work, and proving that you're more than your worst moments. The guard never sleeps, and neither should we.